Today we will learn and reflect on the commentaries of the great medieval rabbis on the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and from rabbis and collections of sayings on the Talmud on the commandment, do not envy or do not covet. Perhaps the prohibition against coveting, the last of the commandments, is referred to in the mitzvah forbidding us to build a roof on a house without a parapet or a short wall. And the negative mitzvah 298, when you build a new home, you are to make a fence for your roof, so you do not place blood liability in your house. For someone who should fall may fall from your roof. Now, in the ancient cities in the Middle East, many people slept on the roof in the cool evening air, and without a parapet they would roll off several stories into the street. When we covet, we tear down the parapet guarding our soul and risk rolling into more tangible sins like theft, murder, and adultery. And in the next painting we see another view of an improper use of a parapet, where King David is looking over the rooftops of his kingdom, looking for rooftop bathers escaping the summer heat. David spies and covets the beautiful Bathsheba, wife of his loyal soldier Uriah the Hittite. And we learn from this story that parapets in our soul guard us from sins that parapets on roofs cannot. At the end of our talk, we'll discuss the sources we use for this video. Please feel free to follow along in our PowerPoint script posted to SlideShare. Please, we welcome interesting questions in the comments. Let us learn and reflect together. Who are the medieval rabbinical commentators on the Torah? The earliest is Rashi, a medieval French rabbi from the 11th century. Rashi was famous both for his commentary on the Talmud and on the Tanakh, and in particular the first 5 books of the Old Testament known to Jews as the Torah or Chumash, and that is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Rambam, with an M, or Maimonides, was a medieval Sephardic Jewish philosopher, and he was born a little bit later in Cordoba, Spain, but lived most of his life in Egypt. We will be studying his summary of 613 commandments drawn from the Torah, and that's broken down into 248 thou shalt positive commands and 365 negative thou shalt not commandments. Now Ramban, with an N, or Nachmanides, was a Sephardic rabbi and philosopher also born after Rambam in Spain, and he immigrated to Jerusalem after the First Crusade. He was known both for his commentary on the Torah, which we will consult, and for his writings on the Kabbalah, or mystical writings on the Torah. Also, there are important differences in how the Jewish rabbis translate the word for the Almighty One. For many devout Jews, the name for the Lord is too holy to speak, so either they translate it as Adonai, the merciful one, or as Elohim, the judgmental one, although there are other names like the Almighty or the Shekinah for shining. And when they discuss the deity, they use GD instead. I know that in English sometimes GD is short for a cursing phrase, but this is the Jewish reverential practice. And I also want to point out that if you look in the Bible where any time it says Lord, Lord, the Jews usually translate that as Adonai and Elohim, for both the merciful and judgmental aspects of the Almighty. In the Jewish numbering of the commandments, coveting is one commandment, including both coveting your neighbor's wife and coveting your neighbor's possession. What can we say about coveting? Coveting is caused by selfishness. The wandering, coveting eye sours relationships and destroys marriages. We can combat covetousness and envy by seeking to be kind and generous towards our neighbor, loving our neighbor as ourselves. Why study backwards through the Decalogue? Why start with the commandment against coveting, when the Torah and most commentators start with the commandment to fear Elohim, to love Adonai our God? We will start with coveting because we too easily forget we cannot love God without loving our neighbor, and by selflessly loving our neighbor we can love God. Now, the first book of the Torah has but a handful of Noahide laws. These are what theologians today would call natural laws, laws that we sense instinctually. Instead, Genesis contains story of how we should treat our loved ones, but mostly story after story about how we shouldn't treat them. Perhaps the lesson here is, what does it matter if we study the Torah day and night, if we treat those around us badly, if their lives are not better because we are in them? How true is Ramban's observation that the man who does not covet will never harm his neighbor? Now Rambam splits coveting into 2 mitzvot, the negative mitzvah 265 and 266. Do not covet your neighbor's house. Do not covet your neighbor's wife, his slave, his maid, his ox, his donkey, or anything else that belongs to his neighbor. Ramban lists these two mitzvot as one because the emphasis differs in Exodus and Deuteronomy. In Exodus, we're forbidden to covet, while Deuteronomy forbids the mere desiring. Not only is coveting and envy forbidden, we are also forbidden to plot or scheme to acquire that which is our neighbor's. The mere expression of desire is forbidden, even if we offer to pay full price for what can be bought, because sometimes even if we pay full price, our neighbor may still believe he was taken advantage of. The mitzvah against coveting appears in slightly different form in Exodus and Deuteronomy. In Exodus, you're forbidden to covet your neighbor's house, and then you're forbidden to covet his wife. In Deuteronomy, you are forbidden first to covet your neighbor's wife, and then you're forbidden to desire his house. Now in Deuteronomy, you cannot covet his field, and in both versions, you cannot covet or desire his slaves, his ox, his donkey, or anything else that is your neighbor's. If the tablets were written today, you can be sure that your neighbor's car would be on the list. No, coveting is perverse idolatry. The coveting, the looking, the desiring always precedes theft and adultery. Ramban suggests that coveting your neighbor's wife is listed first in Deuteronomy because it is the greatest sin of all. Now, we live in an equal opportunity world, so coveting your neighbor's husband is just as much of a sin. Do we cheapen that which we covet? Is Adonai warning us that when we covet our neighbor's wife, we see her not as a person, but as a trophy to be won? And can trophies be loved? So many questions, so few answers. Our world is far different from the world of Jacob and Joseph. We are not hospitable, we are not generous, and we do not welcome strangers in our home. We lock our doors from all who live outside. Today, if someone you meet is hot and sweaty, the last thing you want to do is invite them in your house for dinner. But this was not always so. In the hot desert days of old, when men rode by camel rather than by car, long hot days with no air conditioning, days when nothing but the evening breeze could cool the sweltering heat, when inns were few and crude, then godly men would share their tent with you and kill their calf for you to feast. In the commentary to Rashi, the sages teach that it is greater to invite travelers into your house than to greet the divine presence. When Abraham in Genesis sees men who are angels, he runs to meet them, bows before them, begs them to stay and rest so he can wash their feet and kill his choice tender calf for them to eat. Now you may argue that Abraham knew they were angels, but in another story, when angels visit his brother Lot, he also urges the strangers to stay so he can wash their feet and make a feast for them also. Who among us treats all men with such eagerness, expecting visiting angels among those we meet who are hot and sweaty? We also remember Eliezer, the servant of Abraham, when he crossed the desert to the well near the house of Abraham's brother to seek a wife for his son Isaac. Eliezer asked Adonai for a sign for the woman who would be a fitting wife for a patriarch, and the sign was simply this: a woman, when he asked her for a drink, would offer to provide water for his camels also. As an aside, we know Eliezer did not succumb to the sin of envy, because Abraham had previously discussed with him how he could be his adopted first son when he was barren. But now that Sarah had borne Isaac, Eliezer is still trusted with the quest to find a Jewish wife for the true firstborn son of Abraham, Isaac. And when Eliezer went to the well, not only did Rebekah offer Eliezer water to drink, but she did it quickly, and then she said, "I will draw water for your camels until they have finished drinking." Those nomadic patriarchs had so little, but they were so eager to share what they had. But we live in the most prosperous and peaceful times in history, but it is not enough. We are selfish. We want what our neighbor has. We think first of ourselves, what we want, what will make us happy. We are jealous. We scheme. We find fault. We plot. The first sin involved coveting. Eve in Genesis 3 saw that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was good for food, and that the tree was tempting to the eyes, and that the tree was appealing as a means of obtaining wisdom. She took of the fruit and she ate, and she also gave it to her husband Adam, and he ate. Now what followed the eating of this precious apple? The eyes of both of them were opened, and they realized that they were naked. Shame thus followed the first coveting, and shame follows the knowledge of evil. And Adonai walked in the garden, calling out to the man, "Where are you?" Rashi says that GD knew where he was. It was only to engage in conversation with him so that he would not be too bewildered to repent. But man blamed woman, and woman blamed the serpent, and both were banished from the garden. In the sin of the next generation, Cain coveted Adonai's blessing of his brother Abel's sacrifice. And what was Adonai's warning to Abel in Genesis 4? Why are you angry? Why are you depressed? Is this not so? If you improve, there is forgiveness. But if you do not improve, sin rests at the entrance. Its desire is unto you, but you can master it. And Rashi adds that sin rests at the entrance of your grave. Again, Adonai walks the earth asking Cain, where is your brother Abel? Rashi says Adonai wants to engage him in casual conversation so that he may repent and say, I killed him and have sinned to you. Even the search for Adonai's blessing is cheapened by the coveting. Rather than repent, Cain lies. I know not. Am I my brother's keeper? Perhaps if he had confessed, he would have been restored, but Cain too is banished. After Adonai cries out the cry that heaven and earth cry out when we sin irreversible sins. What have you done? So Cain murders Abel because he covets the favor Adonai showed Abel. Favor that would have been his also if he'd only sincerely asked for it. The enemy would rather we not seek Adonai's favor, but failing in that, he seeks to twist even the most noble of pursuits into a vulgar gesture. Now I was wondering where to place the mitzvot forbidding kings to accumulate excess horses, numerous wives, and abundant wealth. What happened when the wise King Solomon accumulated excess horses, wives, and wealth? These foreign wives led King Solomon to idolatry. And the Torah sees idolatry as a form of religious adultery. So what happens to us when we accumulate wealth and expensive cars? What happens when we want to be like Madonna, the material girl? We fall into idolatry. We risk neglecting the love of our neighbor, and particularly our poor neighbors. And it occurred to me, compared to all those who lived in the ancient world, we all live like kings. We live far longer than those in the ancient world and in far greater health. We have an education where even children of maids can go to school and become doctors and lawyers and accountants. In addition, we in the modern world have possessions I never dreamed about, like televisions and computers, and the greatest invention of all, aspirin. And why do I say aspirin? Well, it was very common for kings and commoners alike in the ancient world to die of high fever. Fever we can control today with simple aspirins. So let us start from the section where Moses predicts that the people will long for a king. And that's negative Mitzvah 362. You arrive in the land that Adonai your God is giving you, and inherit it, and live in it, and you say, let me appoint over me a king like all the nations around me. Are you to appoint over yourself a king who Adonai your God will choose? From among your brothers are you to appoint over yourself a king? You may not place over yourself a foreigner who is not your brother. We quoted this rather than paraphrase it to see the repetition, casting the command in both positive and negative forms. The classic commentators also discuss this mitzvah as it pertains to kings. But to us living today, it tells us to choose our rulers with care. This not only means our political leaders, but also choosing to work for a company or accepting clients who are honest and can be trusted, and also to choose our husband or wife with care. We want to associate with people who encourage us to lead an honest and godly life, and not place ourselves in a situation where we will be asked to hurt or neglect others. Now, who shall we choose to surround us in our daily lives? Those who are not selfish, those who are generous, not those who always want to take from others. And this is the negative mitzvah about the kings and horses. However, he, the king, must not acquire an abundance of horses for himself, so that he will not return to the people of Egypt, in order to acquire an abundance of horses. Because Adonai told you, you are not to proceed to return along this route again. We must not return to Egypt. We must not return to a godless, selfish life. The commentators note that the king can gather funds needed to run the kingdom, but must not keep the wealth for himself. Negative Mitzvah 364. He, the king, is not to acquire an abundance of wives for himself, so his heart will not veer. And 365. And silver and gold he, the king, may not accumulate for himself in great abundance. It's interesting how the Torah links together excess wives and wealth. Perhaps this warns us how things of this world can push us over the edge into a life of selfishness. Why do we seek excess wealth? So we can share with those who are poor? No, we don't want to fall in poverty. We want to live in a life of comfort. What do we primarily seek when we seek romance? So we can find someone we can care for? No, we want to find somebody who will love us like our parents did. And we want to find someone who will make us happy. But our partner's happiness? Well, that's their business. And we're going to show a slide on divorce care because I was involved in this ministry, and I think it's a great ministry. Pondering this, we can ask ourselves, how can men or women, after being married for 10 or 20 years with children, just march in and say to their spouse that they are no longer in love and march out? Sometimes to their lovers, sometimes just to find themselves, like they're breaking up in high school. How can someone totally disregard the feelings of a spouse who loves them and is deeply attached to them? How can someone totally disregard the feelings of their children? How can someone just walk out knowing that their spouse may even consider suicide? Are their own feelings so important that they can just walk out like that? This is a type of coveting. The Talmud has some stories about the proper kind of wealth. The Talmud tells us a story of the first century convert to Judaism, King Adia Bene, who during the famine gave away all his wealth to the poor. When his relatives criticized him for squandering his riches, he replied, "My ancestors stored up treasures for below, but I have stored up treasures for above. They stored their treasures in a place where power can prevail, but I in a place where force is powerless. They stored up treasures of money, but I of souls. They stored up treasures for others, but I for my own good. They stored up treasures in this world, but I stored treasures for the world to come." Although the king is forbidden to hoard silver and gold, in the next mitzvah mentions another type of treasure that you can gather all your days without measure, and that's positive mitzvah 17. "And it shall be when he occupies the throne of his kingdom, the king must write for himself a duplicate of this Torah in a scroll form before the Kohanim, the Levites. It is to accompany him, and he is to read in it all the days of his life, in order that he learn to fear Adonai his God, and guard every word of this Torah, and these statutes to fulfill them." The king should not only learn the Torah, he should also copy it, have the Torah accompany him on his journey, read it, and learn from it, and guard the words of the Torah and fulfill them. And we are told in the Decalogue simply not to steal, not to murder, not to adulter, but in the last commandment we are given a list of what we should not covet of our neighbors. But it is impossible to covet the most precious treasure of all, the teachings of the Torah, and we can share with our neighbor the Torah learning without measure. Why should the king read the Torah all the days of his life? That his pride may not increase over his brother, and he does not stray from the commandment left or right, so that the days of his reign are lengthy over his kingdom, he and his sons within Israel. Just as the king should only accumulate vast treasures for the sake of his kingdom, so we should study the Torah primarily to learn how we should live our life. Coveting is a sin of attitude. Who among us has never coveted? Who among us will never covet? It is fitting that the mitzvah forbidding coveting is followed in the Torah by the mountains made to smoke by an angry Elohim. Coveting crouches at our door, but we must master it. Through the door of coveting come all major sins: adultery, stealing, murder, slandering, and all selfishness. And we should fear him who makes mountains to smoke and skies to shake and souls to shudder. And fear fell upon Israel after the issuing of this last commandment in Exodus 20. All the people saw the sounds, the flames, the sound of the shofar, and the mountain smoking, and the people saw and trembled and stood far off. They said to Moses, "You speak to us and we will listen. Let Elohim not speak with us any more, lest we die." Moses said to the people, "Do not be afraid. It was to exalt you that Elohim came in this manner, so that fear of him will be on your faces, that you do not sin." And Rashi explains, "Due to the fact that you saw him, he is feared and dreaded. You will thereby know that there is none beside him, and you will therefore fear him." As Hillel used to say, an empty-headed person does not dread sin, and an ignorant person cannot be pious, and a bashful person cannot learn, and an irritable person cannot teach, and someone engrossed in trade cannot be a sage, and where there are no men, strive to be a man. Now we'll discuss the sources we use for this video. Whether you're Christian or Jewish, the study of the medieval and Talmudic commentaries on the moral laws of the Decalogue will teach and exhort you to renew your twofold love of God and your love of your neighbor. Indeed, the book of Deuteronomy restates the commandment: love God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your mind, and with all of your strength, in over a dozen differing formulations. We have another video reflecting on the commentaries of the medieval rabbis, Rashi, Rambam, and Ramban, plus many modern summaries of the modern collections of the moral teachings from the Talmud and Torah. This series of YouTube videos on the Decalogue and the Torah is pulled from the chapters from the unpublished work by my Jewish cousin, Jonah Fisher, who was offended by a bar mitzvah he attended where the divorced father chose both to participate in the service and to dance with his younger newlywed wife to the music of the band while his mother was watching at the reception afterwards. And the book is aptly titled, 160 Reasons Not to Dance with the Other Woman at Your Son's Bar Mitzvah. Now this book is unpublished, as he's formally not a rabbi, nor is he a doctor or a lawyer of any sort. This book is merely his writing out the Torah as we are bid to do once in our lives, since we all live like ancient kings. Now there are 160 rather than 613 reasons, since the individual dietary and festival laws are not primarily moral laws. And he organized them its vote according to their corresponding commandment in the Decalogue, and in an opening chapter, he sees if he can score the perfect 10, if this irreverent father had broken all 10 commandments with his dancing with the other woman at his son's bar mitzvah. The YouTube description links to the video script and our blog. Please support our channel by sharing this video with your friends and by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons, and by clicking on the Amazon links to purchase any of the books we discussed, which will earn us a small affiliate commission. And please consider becoming a patron of our channel. And please click on the links for interesting videos on other topics that will broaden your knowledge and improve your soul. Thank you.